Thunder ripped across the sky, just as the old man's heart split in two. Pushed in an old shopping cart by his own son, he was mercilessly abandoned in a cold landfill. "You're just a burden," the son said, and then turned his back in the rain, leaving his father shivering among the reeking rubble. He thought he had just gotten rid of a dead weight. He had no idea that, right in that forgotten place, a fortune buried for 40 years was about to be found. A fortune that wouldn't just change the old man's destiny, but was also the only thing that would decide his own life or death in the future. Welcome, compassionate souls. Have you ever felt forgotten by the world, treated as if you were worthless? The story you're about to see will prove that even when you're treated like trash, your dignity is still a treasure. Hit the like button if you believe in second chances, and subscribe so you don't miss these emotional journeys that touch the soul. Now, let's begin. Rain falls furiously on the rusted rooftops, as if the sky itself were crying for what was about to happen. The drops hammer with force on the soaked earth, dragging dry leaves, mud, and silences that hurt. In the middle of that dark night, barely illuminated by the lightning that rips the sky for brief seconds, a trembling figure is pushed inside an old, creaking shopping cart that groans with every step. The man inside, barely covered with an old blanket that no longer manages to shield him from the cold, clings to a small, faded duffel bag, as if it held the last thing he has left in this world. His hands tremble not only from the cold, but from the confusion and fear that begin to seep into his soul, like the rain filtering through every seam of his wet clothes. Mark pushes the cart hurriedly, his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the muddy path. This wasn't just any industrial outskirt of Newark. This was the edge of the old city landfill, the one that bordered the very neighborhood they had lost their house in years ago, after his mother died. The place smelled of failure and forgotten memories, the sound of his steps splashing in the mud, mixed with the murmur of his voice. "It's all gone, Dad. The money's gone, the house is gone. There's nothing left for you. You're just a burden," he says, the words a bitter mix of his own desperation and a coldness that would haunt him. Arthur slowly turns his head, his gaze searching for his son's face, but he only manages to see the silhouette hardened by anger, by shame, by something he can't quite understand. He says nothing, just clings tighter to his wet blanket, trying to hide the tears that well up without permission, mingling with the relentless rain. The potholes in the path shake the cart, and with every jolt, the old man's weak body slides slightly to one side. The water falls in sheets, soaking everything, as if the world wanted to wash away a guilt too large. Arthur takes a deep breath. His lungs whistle with effort. He tries to remember the last time his son looked at him with tenderness, the last time they shared a quiet chat in the backyard. But all that seems so distant now, like borrowed memories from another life. He had tried not to be a bother. He had learned to walk more slowly, not to ask so much, to eat what was left over, to stay quiet. But none of that was enough. The road gradually disappears between twisted trees and piles of garbage that signal the end of the path. Mark stops the cart abruptly, lowers his head. He takes a deep breath and, without looking at his father, tells him to get out. Arthur looks at him, confused. He doesn't understand why they are there, in this place that smells of rot and abandonment. In a barely audible voice, he asks if they are lost, if they need help. But Mark doesn't answer. He just opens his father's duffel bag, takes out an extra blanket, and throws it onto some damp cardboard, as if that could soften what he was doing. Then he takes the old man's arm firmly, but without roughness, and helps him out. Arthur trembles even more, not just from the cold, but because something inside him begins to scream, an intuition he refuses to accept. He looks around and sees piles of waste, rusted cans, broken furniture, single shoes, frameless portraits. Everything that once belonged to someone is now forgotten, as if the world had decided to close the door on them. When his feet touch the muddy ground, he feels that something has broken forever. Mark tells him to wait there a moment, that he'll be right back. But his voice sounds hollow, distant, as if he knows he doesn't plan to return. The old man nods, still not fully understanding. He sits slowly on the wet cardboard and watches his son walk away into the mist that is beginning to rise. Every step Mark takes seems more final, more cruel. He doesn't turn back, he doesn't hesitate, he doesn't stop. He simply disappears into the shadows, leaving behind the one who gave him life. Arthur is left alone, hugging himself, staring into nothingness. The rain soaks him completely. The blanket is useless now. The cold seeps into his bones, but what hurts most isn't the dampness, or the mud, or even the abandonment. What hurts most is the betrayal, the certainty that the son he cradled in his arms, the one he taught to ride a bicycle, the one he made hot cocoa for on stormy nights, has now left him there like an old piece of furniture that no longer has any use. Minutes pass, then an hour, then another. No sign of anyone. The wind howls through the debris, making empty bottles whistle and banging dilapidated doors hanging from makeshift shelters. Arthur tries to get up to find shelter, but his legs don't respond well. He leans with difficulty on a stick he finds nearby and takes a few staggering steps through the trash. Every object he steps on seems to tell a sad story, a story that no longer matters. He finds a broken lawn chair, sits down, and covers his head with the damp blanket, trying to think, to understand, to remember something that gives meaning to all this. Then, in that instant of absolute loneliness, something inside him dies, but something also ignites. A slow, almost imperceptible fire, a spark of dignity that still survives, a whisper from the soul telling him it's not over yet, that even though he's been thrown out like refuse, he is not trash, that his story has not yet reached the end. He doesn't know how, or when, or why, but something in his chest tells him that this filthy place will not be his grave. That life, however cruel it has been, still holds a corner of light for him. The rain begins to ease. The night slowly retreats, leaving behind a grey, thick sky that announces a dawn without promises. Arthur, soaked, dirty, and trembling, looks at the sky for a long time. His eyes, tired but still alive, search the clouds for a sign. And although he sees no angels, no miracles, no answers, he sees clarity. And in that clarity, a small hope begins to grow, silent but firm, because even in the darkest place, dignity does not die. And sometimes, just when the world forgets you, destiny begins to write the most unexpected chapter. The first light of dawn barely hints at the horizon when Arthur's eyes, still swollen from crying and exhaustion, open slowly, forced by the cold that chills to the bone. His whole body aches, as if the night's dampness has clung to his flesh, and his completely soaked clothes have partially dried, sticking to his skin like a second layer of abandonment. The sour, penetrating smell of the dump envelops him again, more intense, more real than ever. And it is in that moment, turning his head and seeing the subtle movement of a rat, sniffing among some torn bags nearby, that he becomes fully aware of where he is. For an instant, he wishes it had all been a nightmare, a delirium caused by fever or a bad dream. But reality doesn't disguise itself. He is alone, dirty, thrown in the midst of rot, among pieces of broken furniture, empty bottles, ownerless toys, and smells that twist his stomach. He sits up with effort, supporting his hands on the damp ground, but he barely manages to lift his torso when his legs tremble uncontrollably and give way beneath him. A dull groan escapes his lips, and he falls back onto the makeshift mattress that served as his bed, made of wet cardboard and torn rags. He closes his eyes for a moment and breathes, deeply, trying to gather what little courage he has left. He can't stay there. He can't die in the trash as if he never mattered. Around him, life continues in a strange way. Some birds flutter overhead, looking for scraps of food. Distant noises are heard. An engine, a dog barking, the voice of someone haggling at a nearby flea market. The world keeps spinning, even though he has been thrown out of it. Arthur drags himself slowly, using his arms for support, to an area where the trash seems less dense. He feels the mud seeping between his fingers. The penetrating odor makes him cough, but he keeps moving with the silent determination of someone who doesn't want to disappear without a trace. As he moves, his eyes stop on a corner where some rotten pieces of wood partially cover something. It's a dark corner, but there's a glint that catches his attention, a fleeting reflection escaping between the cracks. Curious, and with his heart pounding, he approaches. With effort, he moves the damp planks one by one, fighting against the weight, against the pain in his joints, against the fear that tells him maybe he shouldn't touch anything in this place. Finally, when the last piece of wood falls aside, he sees it, an old, rusted metal box half buried in dirt, rags, and plastic scraps. He looks at it carefully, not yet daring to touch it. He wonders how many years it has been there, what story it holds, who put it in that place, and why it seems to be so carefully hidden. With trembling hands, he begins to dig it out. The damp earth soils his fingernails, scrapes his fingers, but he doesn't stop. When he finally manages to pull the entire box out, he holds it in his lap with a mixture of reverence and fear. It's heavier than he expected. He sits on an old tire and observes it for several seconds before deciding to open it. His fingers search for the edge of the lid, and as he lifts it, a faint metallic creak breaks the silence. Inside, wrapped in dirty, moth-eaten rags, are several long, shiny objects. He doesn't immediately recognize what they are, but the golden gleam that peeks through the dirty folds leaves him breathless. Arthur carefully pushes the rags aside and discovers with wide eyes what appear to be gold bars, thick, heavy pieces that shine even under the layer of dust and grime. For an instant, he remains motionless, not fully understanding what he has in his hands. His heart beats so loudly it thunders in his ears. It can't be. He rubs his eyes, doubting his sight, his judgment, his luck. He wonders if what he sees is real, if it's not a trick of his tired mind, if perhaps he hasn't gone completely mad. But no, he holds them in his hands, one by one. They are real. The weight, the cold of the metal, the shine, everything confirms what he doesn't dare to think. Just like that, the universe answers. The man who was treated as trash is now holding a fortune. This is more than just money, friends. It's a second chance. But what does a man who has lost everything do with such a dangerous secret? He doesn't understand much about value, but he knows this is worth a lot. Perhaps a fortune, enough to change his life, to start over, to never depend on anyone again. But just as the excitement begins to surface, a feeling of anxiety washes over him. What does one do when one finds something like this? Who does it belong to? Why was it hidden? What if someone is looking for it? Fear, that's what he feels now. Fear of having something that doesn't belong to him. Fear that someone will come for it. Fear that life will snatch this opportunity from him, as it has with everything else. However, there is also something deeper beginning to grow inside him. The feeling that for the first time in a long time, fate has looked upon him with different eyes, as if the universe, seeing him lying there like refuse, had decided to deal him a new card, a second chance to write his ending with dignity. Arthur takes a deep breath and rewraps the bars in the rags. He closes the box carefully, as if guarding a sacred secret. He looks around to make sure no one has seen him. There's no one, only rats, torn bags, dead trees, and a grey sky. He stands up with difficulty, clutches the box to his chest, and begins to walk with no clear direction, but with a firmness he hadn't felt in years. Every step hurts, but his mind is racing, imagining possibilities, building simple dreams. A dry room, a bed, warm bread, maybe a dog. He doesn't think of luxuries. He doesn't want riches. He just wants to live without fear, without depending, without being a burden to anyone. As he walks, he remembers Mark's voice telling him he was a nuisance. It hurts, yes, but he holds no hatred for him. He thinks that maybe his son was also a victim of a hard life, of frustrations, of pains he never knew how to express. But he doesn't want to think about that anymore. Now he holds something in his hands that could change everything. And for the first time, the future doesn't seem so dark. For the first time in a long time, Arthur feels something inside him shining again. It's not just the gold he found that morning among the debris. It's his dignity, his worth, his hope. And although he doesn't know it yet, this discovery will not only transform his life, it will also unexpectedly touch the fate of the one who cast him into oblivion. With the box still wrapped in old rags and hidden inside an improvised tote bag made from a burlap sack, Arthur began to walk without a clear direction, driven more by instinct than by reason, his body tired, but his heart beating with a mixture of fear and hope he hadn't felt in years. His legs, though numb from the previous night's cold, moved with a silent determination, as if they understood that something important awaited him at the end of this uncertain journey. He didn't know the area well, but he vaguely remembered seeing on one of his forced walks during the years he lived with Mark an old pawn shop, a place with dusty display cases filled with old watches, stacked books, and objects that seemed from another time. He decided to head there with slow but firm steps, dodging broken sidewalks, curious glances, and potholes hidden under murky puddles. The sun was timidly breaking through the clouds, and the morning air carried that sour aroma of the waking city. Stale coffee, fresh baked bread, exhaust fumes, and the routine in motion. Arthur moved forward with his gaze lowered, careful with each step, the sack clutched to his chest, as if protecting a piece of his soul. When he arrived in front of the shop, an old bell hung from the rusted door frame, like the rest of the place. He pushed carefully, and the door creaked as if protesting having to open. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with dust, time and secrets. Shelves overflowing with forgotten objects were piled one on top of the other, and in the back, behind a scratched wooden counter, a man with thick glasses and white hair read a newspaper with tiny print. Noticing his presence, he looked up, frowning slightly, as if trying to recognize him, and said in a hoarse voice that if he was looking to pawn something, he needed ID. Arthur replied, saying he wasn't here to pawn anything, at least not yet, that he just needed someone trustworthy to look at something he didn't know how to explain. The shop owner, used to receiving strange customers and even stranger items, set the newspaper aside and motioned with his hand for him to approach. Arthur, with a mixture of respect and fear, placed the sack on the counter, opened it slowly, and with trembling hands, took out one of the gold bars, still wrapped in the dirty rag he had found in the box. The shop owner froze. His eyes widened with a mix of surprise and caution, and for an instant, he said nothing. He took the object carefully, held it up to the dim light coming through the window, and examined its edges, its weight, the texture of the metal. Then he muttered that this wasn't just anything, that these types of bars hadn't been seen in decades, and that the seal on the bottom matched a shipment stolen during a major heist over 40 years ago, a peculiar case that was never fully solved. He said many theories emerged then, that some believed the thieves had killed each other, others that the gold was buried for fear of being discovered, but in the end, no one ever claimed that treasure. As he spoke, his fingers caressed the bar as if holding a piece of history itself, and his voice became softer, almost reverent, when he said he had heard rumors, even legends, of an old lost booty in the city's underbelly, but he never thought he'd see it with his own eyes. He looked up at Arthur, and in a serious tone, asked if he had found more. Arthur lowered his gaze. He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said yes, he had found several more, but he didn't plan to sell them all, that he didn't want riches or luxuries, that he just needed enough to start a new life, far from those who despised him, far from those who threw him away, as if he were worthless. The shop owner nodded slowly, understanding more than what was said. He didn't ask how or where he had found them. He simply said that if he ever decided to sell one, he could put him in touch with someone discreet and reliable, but that he had to be extremely careful. Arthur thanked him in a low voice. He took the bar again, wrapped it tenderly, and put it back in the sack. He said goodbye with a nod and left as silently as he had arrived, leaving the shop owner with a distant look and a racing heart, as if he had just witnessed something that couldn't be told. Back on the street, the traffic noise seemed more distant. The sun had gained some strength, and the faces of the people passing by seemed different, as if he himself had changed. He walked aimlessly for a good while, thinking about what he would do, where he could rent a room, how to hide his identity without raising suspicion. He knew he couldn't stay near the dump, nor could he return to the neighborhood where he lived with Mark. He needed to disappear, to reinvent himself, to protect what he had found, not just for its material value, but because it represented his rebirth, his second chance. He understood in that moment that he hadn't just unearthed gold from the rubble, but also a version of himself he thought was lost, a man capable of starting over, of having dignity, of taking the reins of his destiny with trembling but firm hands. The silence of the secret he now carried was heavier than the box itself. He couldn't share it with anyone, couldn't fully trust strangers, but that didn't bother him. He had learned to live in solitude, to converse with his memories, to draw strength from silence. He knew this burden was his, that fate had given it to him for a reason, and that he must honor it not with ostentation or revenge, but with wisdom, with discretion, with humility. He thought of Mark, of his harsh words, of the way he looked at him as if he were worthless. He felt a pang of pain in his chest, not so much for the contempt, but for what they had both lost, a relationship, a history, a connection that once existed, But he didn't let himself dwell on it, not out of pride, but because he knew that now he had to focus on surviving, on protecting his secret, on building a small refuge where he could live out his remaining time without depending on anyone. That night, he slept on a bench in an abandoned bus station, with the box by his side, covered by his coat. He didn't feel cold, he didn't feel fear. For the first time in a long time, he felt peace, because he knew something in his story had changed forever. Because even though he still didn't have a home, or a new name, or a clear plan, he had something no one could ever take from him, the right to decide what to do with his life. And that, for someone who was thrown out like trash, was everything. The sun falls warmly on the rooftops of a small borough in Hunterdon County, forgotten between rolling hills and gravel roads, where the houses are vinyl-sided with aging shingle roofs that sing when it rains. In one of those humble little houses, with a rock garden and a hammock hung between two wooden posts, lives a man everyone knows as Mr. Carl. No one in town knows exactly where he came from, only that he arrived one morning with an old bag on his shoulder, a serene but distant expression, and a soft voice that always says, "Thank you," with respect. The house he lives in isn't large or luxurious, but it's spotless. The hand-washed white curtains move with the breeze. The plants on the windowsill bloom brightly, and everything in that corner gives a feeling of care, of calm, of hands that have learned to rebuild life from silence. Months have passed since that dawn when he was left like an old rag amidst the trash, and yet every detail in the way he lives reveals that something inside him hasn't fully healed. Arthur, now known as Mr. Carl, gets up every day before dawn, prepares his coffee in an old percolator, sweeps the porch, and greets the first neighbors crossing the street on their way to work with a discreet nod. Some ask him if he needs anything. Others offer him bread or vegetables from their gardens. He always responds with the same gentleness, thanking them, but without giving more details. He is respected by everyone, especially by the town's elderly, whom he helps whenever he can. He has become a sort of discreet angel. He changes light bulbs, fixes broken chairs, accompanies the frailest to the local clinic, and although he doesn't say much, his eyes always have that look of someone who has seen too much, but still chooses kindness. A neighbor, Mrs. Joyce, commented one day that that man has a father's hands, and she said it with restrained tears, as if his presence reminded her of a loved one who is gone. No one knows that this man once had another name, another history, another home. No one knows the weight he carries in his chest, nor the secret he zealously guards in a metal box hidden under the floorboards, wrapped in the same rags he found it in. The gold is still there, untouched, like a silent witness to a past that changed his course forever. Every so often, he checks it, not to count the bars or to think about selling them, but as if by looking at them, he could reassure himself that all of it wasn't a strange dream, but a harsh, unexpected reality that turned him into another man. With that money, he bought the little house where he now lives. He paid in cash without giving his real name. He left behind every document, every trace that could lead him back to the one who once called him Dad with affection, but who later despised him as if he were less than a stranger. In the small living room of his house, there are few things. A wooden table, 2 chairs, an old clock that always runs 3 minutes fast, and on the far wall a framed photograph that he has never taken down. It's the image of Mark, his son, taken many years ago, when he was still a young man full of life and promise. Arthur, sitting in his rocking chair in front of that photo, sometimes watches it for hours. He hasn't had the heart to tear it up or hide it. It's there as a constant reminder, like a sweet thorn that reminds him of what he lost, but also of what he still hasn't managed to let go. He has tried to forget. He has tried to forgive. He has tried to convince his heart that it no longer hurts. But one look at those eyes frozen on paper is enough for the silence of his soul to tell him he is still waiting for something that may never come. The town's children smile at him as they pass. They call him Grandpa Carl, and he responds with a pat on the head or a piece of fruit hidden in his pocket. He has built a simple, kind routine, without shocks, but at night, when everything is dark and the world sleeps, he sits on the porch with a blanket on his legs and looks at the sky, as if searching the stars for the answer to all those questions he never dared to ask aloud. He wonders if his son thinks of him, if he ever regretted it, if, in his conscience, there is a place where the memory of a father who loved him above all else lives. Sometimes he strokes the blanket that is now always with him, the same one he was thrown out with. And he thinks that perhaps the real treasure wasn't in the metal box, but in discovering that he is still capable of loving, even after being treated like nothing. The townspeople believe that Mr. Carl was always like this, calm, wise, generous. They don't imagine that behind that gentle smile is a story marked by betrayal, by the cold of a night of no return, by the loneliness of one forgotten by the only being he still called family. He never talks about the past. When someone asks where he comes from, he says from far away, but that he came to stay. He changed his name. Yes, but not to hide from the world, but to give himself the chance to start over without the chains of pain. Because sometimes, to be reborn, one must let the name that carried the full weight of abandonment die. He still hasn't found complete peace. He lives peacefully, yes, but there are nights when the wind brings him voices, memories, smells of another house, of another time. There are days when the silence becomes so deep it seems to scream truths at him that he doesn't want to hear. But he has learned to live with it, to let sadness sit beside him without it devouring him. He has a notebook where he writes stray thoughts, verses that don't rhyme, phrases he shares with no one. On one of the pages, he wrote that there is no greater strength than that of a heart that decides to keep beating, even after being broken. And so lives Mr. Carl among geraniums, homemade bread, and a photograph on the wall. He has built a small refuge where his soul rests, even if it doesn't fully sleep. He has understood that life, no matter how cruel, always leaves a crack where the light can enter. And as long as that light keeps shining, he will keep waking up every day, greeting with respect, taking care of his own, even if his own are no longer near. Because in that forgotten corner of the world, among dirt alleys and warm voices, Arthur has become someone again, not because of the hidden gold, not because of what he left behind, but because of the way he decided to move forward. And that, for a wounded heart, is worth more than any treasure. The morning had begun like any other for Mark, although for weeks, something in his body hadn't felt right. He felt a tiredness that didn't disappear with sleep, a strange weakness that forced him to sit down after climbing just one flight of stairs, a pressure in his chest that came and went like a stubborn shadow. But that morning, something was different. He was in the bathroom, looking at himself in the mirror, fogged up by the shower's steam, when a sudden cough shook him violently. He leaned over the sink, pressing his abdomen with one hand while trying to catch his breath. And that's when he saw it. Drops of thick blood on the white sink, like a crude warning that left no room for denial. He stood there motionless, fingers still at his mouth, chest heaving, cold sweat running down his back. The mirror reflected the image of a man he no longer recognized. His skin had lost its color, his eyes were sunken. His overgrown beard gave him a more disheveled look than he was willing to admit. He told himself it was maybe a bad cold, a passing infection, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. Something was wrong, and he had been ignoring it for too long. He soon went to a clinic. The waiting room was full of people with grey faces, whispers of pain, restless children, and the constant sound of doors opening and closing. Mark sat in silence, hands clasped, his mind suspended between fear and hope. When they finally called him, the doctor received him with a serious expression and a professional voice. He asked him to describe his symptoms, reviewed his preliminary tests, listened to his chest, and then, after a silence that seemed eternal, said they needed to run more tests, that the results weren't conclusive, but that something wasn't adding up. A week later, the diagnosis arrived with the coldness of a sentence. The wheel of fate turns for everyone, even for Mark. The man who was so quick to cast aside a burden now finds his own body failing him. He thought he was free, but he had no idea the real test was just beginning. The specialist, this time accompanied by a nurse, looked at him with downcast eyes as he explained that he had a rare, aggressive disease, that it was affecting his internal organs, and that although they were still in time to fight it, he needed an urgent, expensive, complex operation, which had to be performed in less than a month to avoid irreversible complications. Mark listened in silence, as if the doctor's words were in another language. In the end, he barely managed to ask how much it would all cost, and the figure they gave him left him speechless. He didn't have health insurance. He had stopped paying it over a year ago when his job as a construction supervisor was cut by a tri-state construction firm during a downturn. He lived off odd jobs, and the little he earned barely covered the basic bills. He had no savings, no backup, only fear. That night, he came home and sat on the sofa without turning on the light. He listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the kitchen clock, his wife's footsteps in the next room. When she asked him from the hallway if he was okay, he said they needed to talk. He told her everything in a dull voice, without embellishments, without drama. She listened in silence, and when he finished, she asked how they were going to pay for it. He said he didn't know, that maybe they could get a loan or sell the Ford pickup, something. But before he could continue, she replied, saying she couldn't take it anymore, that she wasn't willing to carry a situation like this, that she didn't love him as she used to, and that staying by the side of a sick man, with no money and no future, wasn't what she had planned for her life. That same night, she packed her bag and left without a tear, without looking back, as if Mark's illness were a stain she had to avoid at all costs. The door closed with a dry sound, and Mark, alone in the middle of a house that no longer felt like his, broke down in a way he hadn't even when he buried his mother, nor when he lost his job, nor when he stopped speaking to his father. The following days were a mixture of medical appointments, frustrated calls to friends who couldn't help, visits to banks where the doors of credit slammed shut one after another. He ate little, slept poorly, and every time he coughed, the metallic taste in his mouth reminded him that time was running out. He began to lose weight, and his movements became slower. People saw him on the street and barely recognized him. No one knew what to say. Some avoided the topic, others simply crossed the street when they saw him coming. He felt invisible, like a ghost of what he had been. And in that state of physical and emotional exhaustion, one afternoon, while sitting on a park bench where he used to play as a child, his thoughts took him to the past, to that dark moment he had buried within himself. He remembered the night he took his father out of the house. He remembered the dark, the roary, rain, Arthur's silence, the gaze he avoided meeting as he left him in that filthy place. He remembered how he justified his actions by saying he was a burden, that he couldn't support him, that he needed space and peace. But now, watching his own life fall apart, he understood that he had committed an unforgivable act. For the first time in years, he said in a low voice, as if talking to himself, that if only his father hadn't kicked him out. And then he corrected himself with pain, saying no, that if only he hadn't kicked his father out. That thought stuck in his mind like a thorn. He wondered where he was, if he was still alive, if he had found a safe place, or if the night he abandoned him was also the night his story ended. The guilt began to weigh more heavily than the illness. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's face in the rain, the frail body, the tired eyes, and that dignity that not even abandonment could erase. He wanted to look for him, but he didn't know where to start. He had no clues. There was no one left who could give him an answer. He felt like a lost, sick, weak child, with no one to turn to. For the first time in his life, he truly wished he could hug that man who raised him with calloused hands and a tender gaze, who taught him to read, who took care of him through every fever, who never denied him a plate of food, even if he didn't have any for himself. And now, when he needed him more than ever, his father wasn't there, because he himself had made sure to erase him from his life. And that truth, that brutal certainty, hit him harder than any diagnosis, because the body can get sick, but there are pains born in the soul, and those cannot be cured with a scalpel. That morning, like so many others since he had begun his new life under the name of Carl, Arthur woke up early, his body a little more tired than usual, but with the intact determination to keep going. The sun was just peeking through the clouds when he calmly prepared his coffee. He took his old hat, a scarf knitted by a grateful neighbor, and walked slowly to the bus stop. He needed to buy some medicines that weren't available in his small town, so he decided to go to the neighboring city, the one he always avoided, for fear of crossing paths with shadows from his past. But that day, something inside him told him it was time to step out of his known boundaries, to dare a little more, even if it was just to fulfill that basic need. The journey was long, but calm. He watched through the window the fields they left behind, the trees bare from winter, the distant houses that seemed painted with nostalgia. He thought about many things, but mostly about how lucky he was to have found peace after so much pain. Not complete peace, but enough to sleep with a clear conscience. Despite the secret he kept, Despite the past, he had learned to breathe without resentment, or at least he thought so, until destiny decided once again to test his soul. Upon arriving downtown, he got off the bus carefully, feeling the bustle of people passing around him as if he were invisible. He walked a few blocks to the nearest pharmacy with a list written on crumpled paper. The traffic was heavy. The streets were full of street vendors, mothers holding children's hands, and young people running with backpacks. At an intersection, while waiting for the traffic light to turn green, his eyes drifted to a corner of the sidewalk where a man lay huddled, his body shrunken from the cold, his face hidden under a hood, and his hands crossed over his abdomen. Arthur felt a knot in his stomach. Something about that figure was familiar, painfully known. He took a few steps closer, cautiously, as if afraid to confirm what his heart was already beginning to scream. When he finally saw the pale, gaunt face of that man, he needed no more to know it was him, his son Mark. Stop for a moment and imagine. The man who destroyed your life, who cast you out, is now right there, just as helpless as you once were. What goes through a heart like Arthur's? Is it anger? Is it pity? Or something else entirely? What he decides to do next, that will be the true test. For a moment, the world stood still. The sound of cars, the voices of people, everything became a distant echo. He stared at him with wide eyes, feeling his legs weaken, and the blood rushed to his head in a wave of confusion. Mark had skin stretched tight over his bones, chapped lips, his body covered by a jacket too thin for the morning's chill. He was breathing with difficulty, and beside him, a plastic bag held what looked like medical papers and a nearly empty water bottle. Arthur took a step back, as if needing to verify it wasn't a mirage, but it was real. The same son who had abandoned him, the same one who had condemned him to oblivion, was now lying there just as he had been once, defeated by life, without strength, without pride. He wanted to approach him, to lift him up, to tell him he was there, but something inside him stopped him. It wasn't fear or pride. It was a complex mixture of pain, compassion, and doubt. Instead of speaking to him, he decided to follow. He waited, hidden in the crowd, until Mark stood up with difficulty, leaning against a wall, and walked with dragging steps toward a side street. For almost an hour, he followed him from a distance, crossing avenues, passing through alleys until they reached St. Michael's Hospital. He watched him enter with his head down, go to reception, speak to a nurse who looked at him with pity. Arthur stayed outside for a few minutes, trying to gather the courage to go in. Finally, he took a deep breath and went through the door. He went to the information desk, saying he needed to ask about oncology treatments for a friend, and the receptionist directed him to a hallway full of benches occupied by people in silence, each carrying their own tragedy. He sat nearby, his ears alert. It wasn't long before he heard a doctor's voice speaking firmly to a patient from a small open office. Arthur recognized that agitated voice. It was Mark. The doctor said he understood his situation, that the hospital had done everything possible to buy him more time, but that if the payment wasn't completed by Friday, the operation would be cancelled. He said that unfortunately, without that surgery, his life expectancy would be drastically reduced, and they needed to make urgent decisions. Mark replied, saying he had no one to turn to, that he had exhausted all his resources, that he didn't want to die like this. His voice broke at the end, barely a whisper, saying he had nothing left. Arthur felt his heart break in two. Tears began to fall without him being able to stop them. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His son, the one who had called him a burden, who had left him among rats and cardboard, was now in the same place of desperation, on the same edge of the abyss. He could leave. He could turn and disappear without being seen, leaving him with the same indifference with which he was abandoned. But he didn't, because something in his soul, something stronger than pain and pride, told him he couldn't ignore it, that forgiveness, even if silent, could change destinies. He left the hospital unseen, his face hidden by his hat and scarf. He walked to the nearest plaza and sat on a bench, trembling, looking at the sky as if searching for answers. He thought about all he had lived through, all he had lost, all he could still do. He knew what he had to do. He knew he couldn't let his son die alone. Not because he deserved it, but because he, Arthur, still believed in love, even after everything. And although his heart was still wounded, he was willing to do whatever was necessary to save him, even if it meant never being recognized. Because there are gestures that don't need applause, they just need love. And that love, the deepest kind, is the one born from silent forgiveness. Arthur stood in front of the hospital for long minutes, motionless, his eyes fixed on the automatic entrance that opened and closed like a constant sigh from that building, which held so many lives hanging by a thread. He was sitting on a metal bench, barely warmed by the sun, his hands clasped and his face hidden beneath the low brim of his hat. His grey wool scarf, the one given to him in the town with such affection, covered part of his face, but it couldn't hide the silent tears falling down his cheeks, tracing paths on the skin weathered by years and pain. He cried without making a sound, as men do when they no longer need to show strength, as those who have learned that true courage isn't in holding back tears, but in letting them speak when the voice breaks. No one stopped to look at him. No one knew that this discreet man, with modest clothes and a downcast gaze, was the father of the young man lying in a bed on the 3rd floor, awaiting an operation that would decide if he lived or died. No one imagined that behind that silence was a broken story, a still open wound, a betrayal that still breathed inside him. But there he was, without resentment, only with the sadness of one who knows that love doesn't always return the way it's given. He took a deep breath, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and slowly stood up. He entered the hospital like a ghost, without drawing attention, with soft steps that didn't disturb the clinical routine. He gave a barely visible nod to the receptionist and went straight to the billing counter, where a middle-aged woman attended to him, her eyes tired from dealing with others' pain every day. Arthur spoke in a low voice, saying he wished to cover the treatment for a patient, that he didn't want to give his name, but he knew the room number and the required procedure. The woman looked up, somewhat bewildered, and asked if he was related to the patient. He replied no, that he was just someone who had decided to help. She insisted, saying that for legal reasons there had to be some record of the donor, but he handed her an envelope with cash and said the money spoke for itself, that if necessary, to take it as an anonymous donation, but to ensure that the young man, Mark Thompson, had access to everything needed for his operation. The woman looked at him with a mixture of compassion and surprise. It wasn't common for someone to arrive like this, without demands, without a name, without promises of gratitude. She accepted the envelope, verified the contents, and confirmed that it was more than enough to cover the medical expenses, even the post-operative care. Arthur nodded in silence, grateful not to have to explain further. Before leaving, he took another envelope from his coat, this one smaller, white, and sealed, with shaky handwriting on the front. He handed it to the same woman and asked her to give it to Mark once he woke up and was out of danger. He said it was important that he read it only after knowing he had survived. She, still not fully understanding, accepted the task and promised to carry it out exactly. Then, without looking back, Arthur left the hospital the same way he had entered, in silence, without leaving a trace, like a shadow of compassion, seeking no applause or recognition. The letter he left was written in blue ink on a carefully folded sheet. The message was brutally simple, intended not to console but to reveal the truth. It contained only one line, followed by his signature: "The man you threw in the trash saved your life." He signed it simply as Arthur, with no titles, no claims, no grudges, because he understood that sometimes the truest love is the one that forces a confrontation with reality, expecting nothing in return. This is the moment. He doesn't just save his son's life, he ensures his son knows who saved it. This isn't revenge. It is a profound, painful lesson in grace, delivered with the quiet strength of a man who refused to be broken. What happens when Mark wakes up and reads those words? The impact will change everything. Upon leaving the hospital, Arthur walked aimlessly through the city for hours. He watched the people, the trees, the street vendors, the children playing in the parks, and everything seemed more alive, more vibrant, as if by making that decision, his soul had been lightened of an old burden. He didn't feel like a hero or a martyr. He simply felt human, with flaws, with wounds, but also with the certainty of having done the right thing. He thought about returning to his town that same afternoon, making his coffee, sitting in the hammock, looking at the sky, and letting the wind whisper to him that, at least for today, he had done something good. He didn't know if Mark would ever forgive him, if he would understand the magnitude of what he had done, but that no longer mattered. because peace doesn't always come from others' recognition, but from being true to oneself. And he, Arthur, the man who was despised, forgotten, and thrown out like a useless object, had responded with love. He had chosen to be an invisible angel, one of those who walk among us without wings, but with hearts full of light. That night, as the city lights began to turn on one by one and the sky painted itself in orange hues, Arthur took the bus back, sat by the window, rested his head, and closed his eyes. He didn't dream of riches or dramatic reconciliations. He dreamed of peace, of a voice telling him he had done the right thing, and that, in his world of silences and scars, was worth more than any buried treasure, because he had chosen to love even when he was not loved. He had chosen to forgive even without being forgiven. He had chosen to live even after they tried to erase him. And in that silent, brave choice, he found his redemption. The monotonous sound of the heart monitor was the only thing breaking the silence of that white room, flooded with the dim light entering through a window covered by semi-translucent curtains. Mark opened his eyes slowly, as if the mere act of waking up took enormous effort. He blinked several times, trying to focus, and immediately felt the weight of his immobile body. An IV in his arm, a dry throat, and a dull pain in his abdomen that made him aware that something inside him had been touched, modified, repaired. He looked around with a confused expression, like someone who doesn't quite remember how they got there. The last image he had in his mind was of a doctor with a grave voice, saying that time had run out, that without money there would be no operation, and then the shadow of desperation enveloping him until he lost consciousness. Now he was there, alive, his heart still beating, breathing without difficulty, and not understanding how it was possible. He tried to speak, but could barely make a hoarse sound. Then he closed his eyes again, as if he needed to start over, this time with the full awareness that he was alive. A few minutes passed until a door opened gently, and a nurse with a kind face entered with a tray in her hands. Seeing him awake, she smiled sincerely and approached to check his vital signs. She told him it was a miracle the operation had been performed in time, that his body had responded well, that everything was under control. Mark wanted to ask how, who, why, but he couldn't form coherent words. The nurse, noticing his confusion, set the tray aside and took a slightly folded white envelope from her pocket with his name handwritten in shaky letters. She explained that someone had left it for him with specific instructions that it should only be delivered if he survived. Then she told him he was very lucky and that he should read the letter calmly, that perhaps he would find answers in it. Before leaving, she placed the envelope on his chest, gave him a pat on the shoulder, and left, leaving him in silence once again, but now accompanied by the weight of the unknown. Mark took the envelope with trembling hands. He looked at it for a few seconds, feeling something stirring inside him, like a deep intuition warning him that this paper contained more than words. He opened the envelope delicately, took out the sheet, and unfolded it slowly. He recognized the handwriting immediately, and his heart stopped for a second. He began to read, line by line, without blinking, as if every word pierced his soul. "The man you threw in the trash saved your life." That's what the first sentence said, written in firm but clumsy strokes, as if emotion had guided the hand more than reason. Signed at the end, Arthur, his father. Mark froze, staring at the sheet as if it suddenly weighed tons. His eyes filled with tears immediately, without control, without restraint, like a dam breaking after years of misunderstood pride. He read the letter again, over and over, unable to believe it, not understanding how it was possible that the man he had rejected, abandoned, humiliated with cruel words, was the one who saved him from death. The letter said nothing more than that. It didn't demand forgiveness. It didn't claim justice. It didn't ask for explanations. It only revealed a silent act of pure, unconditional love. Mark felt something shatter inside him. The pain wasn't physical. It was deep, spiritual, as if suddenly all the wrong decisions of his life fell on his shoulders at the same time. He sat up as best he could. He slowly lowered his legs off the edge of the bed, ignoring the discomfort from his wounds, and fell to his knees on the cold floor of the room. He clutched the letter to his chest and, with a broken voice, cried out, "Dad!" A cry that wasn't just a call but a plea, a confession, an open wound. Tears fell relentlessly onto the paper, soaking the ink, blurring some of those words that were now engraved in his memory. His mind went back to that night, to the rain, to the shopping cart, to the dump, to his father's silence, who said nothing, who didn't reproach him, who didn't ask for an explanation, and now he understood everything. He understood the immense value of that silence, the dignity he never had, the nobility he had betrayed. He wanted to shout louder, to ask for forgiveness, to run and find him, to hug him, to promise him that everything would be different, but the bed, the wound, the tubes kept him tethered to reality. He could only cry and repeat his name over and over, as if that could bring him back, as if repentance had the power to erase the lost years. He remained on his knees for a long time until a nurse entered and helped him back into bed. She said nothing, wiped his face, covered him with the sheet, and stroked his forehead with a maternal gesture. She told him that sometimes miracles arrive in the most unexpected ways, and that the important thing wasn't how it all began, but what he would do with what came next. Mark listened in silence, clutching the letter to his chest, as if it were a piece of his father's soul he could still hold on to. Inside, he made a firm decision. As soon as he could walk, as soon as the doctor discharged him, he would go looking for him, even if he had to search every neighborhood, every town, every corner. He wouldn't rest until he could look him in the eyes, until he could beg for forgiveness on his knees, until he could hug him with a naked heart, because he understood that he didn't deserve that love. But he also understood that his father never loved him because he deserved it, but because he was born of his blood, because he had been part of his story, and now his only mission was to mend what could still be saved. Because the man who had been capable of giving everything without asking for anything deserved more than belated tears. He deserved truth, he deserved redemption, and Mark knew that only by finding it in his father's eyes could he also redeem himself. Mark didn't wait long after being discharged from the hospital. Although his body was still weak and his steps slow, his heart burned with an urgency he hadn't known until that moment. He couldn't stay still. He couldn't continue his life as if nothing had happened. He had a wound that wouldn't heal with medicine or with the passage of time. A wound that could only close if he found his father and asked for forgiveness with his soul in his hand. He left the hospital with the letter still folded in the inside pocket of his jacket, as if keeping it close to his chest gave him strength. He took an NJ transit bus toward the Newark neighborhood, where years ago he had committed the most shameful act of his life. As he looked out the window, he watched the city change. Its face, from modern to marginal, from noise to neglect. The clean avenues gave way to dusty streets, to graffiti-covered walls, to makeshift shops with tarps and wooden crates. Everything felt painfully familiar. The dead trees, the narrow alleys, the corners where he used to walk quickly to avoid greeting neighbors. The landscape seemed frozen in time, as if life had moved on everywhere else, except here. When he got off the bus, a sour smell filled his nose, a mix of garbage, burnt oil, and dampness. He walked slowly through the streets where he once lived with his father, where the nights were cold and the days too long, where poverty coexisted with routine like a permanent guest. He reached the exact spot where he had abandoned him. The lot, now full of debris, still had the same air of sadness, as if it still held the echoes of that rainy night. Mark stood for a few minutes, looking at the ground as if expecting to see his father there, just as he had left him, covered with an old blanket, surrounded by waste. He closed his eyes, and for an instant, the past returned with force. He heard his own voice telling him he was a burden. He felt the cold, the rain, the dampness chilling him to the bone. He opened his eyes quickly, trying to banish the image. He couldn't stop there. He had to look for him. He had to find him. He began to walk through the neighborhood, asking anyone he encountered. He approached a bodega and asked the owner if he remembered an old man who once lived in the area. Someone elderly, quiet, who walked slowly and had a sad look. The man looked at him indifferently and shook his head. He went to the small church, which still withstood the test of time, and asked the parish assistant, a kind young man, who replied that he didn't remember anyone by that name, but that perhaps an older woman who lived near the market could help. Mark walked to the market, and there, among stalls of withered fruit and vegetables wrinkled by the heat, he found a woman with white hair, clear eyes, and wrinkled skin selling herbal remedies. He asked if she knew an old man named Arthur, or perhaps someone who arrived in the area years ago, alone, sick, aimless. The The woman squinted thoughtfully and, after a few seconds, said that, yes, she remembered a very quiet old man with a cane who used to sleep near the canal under a makeshift roof, and that one day he disappeared without a trace. Mark asked for more details. He begged her to tell him if she knew where he had gone, if anyone had seen him afterward. The woman was silent for a moment, and then replied that she had heard a while ago that a good little old man was living on the hill, near a town on the other side of the highway, that he helped the neighbors, that nobody knew much about him, but that everyone liked him. Mark felt his heart leap out of his chest. He asked how to get there, and the woman, with a soft smile, patiently explained the way, pointing with her finger as if indicating a sacred direction. Without thinking twice, Mark ran, got on a bus, then walked for several miles under the sun, his face soaked in sweat, his body screaming for rest, but his soul pushing him forward. Every step was a silent prayer, a plea to heaven that what he had just heard was true, that his father was alive, that it wasn't too late. Upon reaching the town, the tranquility of the place enveloped him like a hug. Simple houses, dirt roads, chickens walking freely, children running after a ball made of rags. He asked a woman washing clothes at a laundromat if she knew an old man who lived on the hill. She smiled and said yes. Everyone called him Mr. Carl, that he was a good man, that he helped the elderly, that he lived alone, but that he always had a kind word. Mark felt his legs tremble. He climbed the hill on a path of stones and dirt, his heart pounding, his breath short, and hope so alive it hurt. When he reached the top, he saw him, sitting in a wooden chair under the shade of a leafy tree, with a cane resting by his side, looking at the horizon like someone conversing with time. He had the same old hat, his back slightly hunched, his hands resting on his knees, and a serene expression, as if he had finally made peace with the world. Mark stopped, unable to take another step. He put a hand to his chest, feeling that forgiveness was a huge knot, tightening his soul. He looked at his father for a long time in silence, his eyes full of tears, and his heart burning with love, guilt, and repentance. For an instant, he wanted to run to him, to hug him, to beg for forgiveness until the sun went down, but he just stood there, watching him, as if he needed to make sure he was real, that this man, this invisible angel, was still there waiting without knowing it, for the son who had lost everything except the chance to mend his ways. Mark remained motionless at the edge of the path, contemplating the scene before him, as if it were a dream his soul had imagined many times, but that his body had never had the courage to reach. The old man, sitting in that chair under the generous shade of a tree that seemed to protect him with tenderness, wasn't just his father. He was a symbol of everything he had ignored, hurt, and lost. He saw him there with his face slightly tilted toward the horizon, the cane resting by his leg, his fingers interlaced on his lap, his gaze lost in the calm of the landscape, as if in silent dialogue with eternity. Mark's heart pounded uncontrollably, as if every beat in his chest reminded him that time was fragile, that opportunities don't return twice in the same form. He took a step, then another, until the slight sound of his footsteps on the dirt made the old man turn his head slowly, with that paused gesture of those who have learned to live without hurry. Arthur's eyes met his son's, and for an instant neither said anything. They just looked at each other. It was a long, heavy gaze, laden with unsaid memories, open wounds, unexpressed love. Mark felt his legs tremble. He approached with clumsy steps, as if walking on sacred ground. When he was close enough for the tree's shadow to cover him too, he stopped, put a hand to his chest, and with a voice broken by emotion, said, "Dad, I'm sorry." It wasn't a rehearsed apology or a formal act. It was a choked cry turned into a whisper. It was a confession that came from the depths of his soul, where the truths that never dared to surface live. He said he had looked for him because he couldn't live with the guilt anymore, that every night since he received the letter, he had dreamed of this moment, that he would understand if he didn't want to listen, but that he needed to ask for forgiveness, even if he didn't deserve it. He said he was a coward who acted selfishly, that he treated him as if he had no value, that he let himself be blinded by his pride and frustration, and that now, standing before him, there was only a broken son asking for a second chance, not to erase the past, but to build, even in the final chapters of their lives, a sincere bond, without silences, without masks. Arthur looked at him in silence for several seconds. His face showed no anger or surprise. It showed something deeper, a mixture of tenderness, compassion, and a gentle sadness that only the wise know how to carry with dignity. He blinked slowly, took a deep breath, and, without moving from his chair, said in a serene voice, "I didn't save you because you deserved it. I did it because I learned to love." Even when rejected, Mark felt those words pierce him like a ray of truth. His father hadn't saved him out of duty or hope of reward, but because he had reached a level of humanity that goes beyond pain, beyond abandonment, beyond any wound. He said that for many years he believed love had to be returned to have value, but that time had taught him that true love is the one given unconditionally, expecting nothing in return, because it comes from a place so deep that not even contempt can touch it. In that moment, Mark fell to his knees in front of him, rested his head on his legs, trembling like a child, and between sobs, repeated over and over that he was sorry, that he loved him, that he wished he could erase that night, that he would give anything to give him back the lost years. Arthur stroked his hair with trembling, gentle hands, just as he used to comfort him as a child after a nightmare. He told him not to think anymore, about what they couldn't change, that life always gives another chance, even if it sometimes arrives late and disguised as pain. He said that he, too, had cried many nights, that he, too, had felt loneliness like a knife, but that he never stopped wishing that one day this hug would come, and now that he finally had it, he wasn't planning to let go. They hugged tightly, a long, sincere hug, full of all the words they never said, of all the tears held back, of all the silences that turned into forgiveness. They cried together as only a father and son can cry, having walked through hell on different paths, and now meeting on the edge of peace. And here, finally, is the reunion we've all been waiting for. This was never about the gold. It was always about this. A father who learned to love unconditionally, and a son who finally, painfully, learned to see. This, right here, is the true treasure. The birds sang in the tree branches. The wind moved the leaves with a soft whisper, and the world seemed to stop around them to give them that eternal moment they had waited so long for. There was no more guilt, no reproaches, only the simple, powerful miracle of two broken hearts that, upon finding each other, remembered that true love always has the last word. And so, amid the silence and the soft afternoon light, peace returned to their hearts, not as a prize, but as a promise fulfilled. Because in the end, there is no force more powerful than the forgiveness born from love, and there is no reunion more profound than the one that heals what seemed impossible to heal. Today we accompanied Arthur on a journey of pain, abandonment, hope, and forgiveness. We saw how a wounded heart can continue to love, even when rejected, and how a silent act can change an entire destiny. Arthur and Mark's journey reminds us of one thing. Forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, it's about liberating the future. True love can be found in the darkest and most unexpected places. The biggest question today is, if you were in Arthur's position, would you have chosen to save Mark? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for dedicating your precious time and emotion to this story. Please hit like and subscribe to join us in exploring more powerful stories about the strength of compassion. See you next time.